you hear people talk about horror stories or possession, it's easy to think that it's just fiction. A way to scare kids around campfires or spice up a Halloween night. But trust me, if you had been there with me, if you had seen what happened to my best friend James, you wouldn't think it was fiction anymore. You would never look at the world the same way again. James had always been the adventurous type, always seeking something new. When he told me he'd found this house on the edge of town, an old, creaky place that had been vacant for years, I didn't think much of it. I mean, sure, it sounded like the setting for a haunted house movie, but I didn't think James would let himself get caught up in that kind of stuff. He was logical, grounded, always the skeptic. But there was something about this house, something that pulled him in. I helped him move in. It was a big place, with old hardwood floors and high ceilings that felt empty, like they were just waiting for something to fill them. The house wasn't what you'd call welcoming. Every room felt cold, and the long, winding hallway seemed like it went on forever. The walls were covered in old wallpaper that was peeling at the edges, and the smell, it was like something had been left stagnant for too long, a smell you couldn't quite place. But it made your stomach turn. He didn't seem to care. He was thrilled to get out of his apartment, to have a place of his own. I remember thinking, he'll get used to it. It's just the old house vibe. But that's where things started to go wrong. It began small, subtle. James would tell me he heard strange noises at night, scraping sounds like something sharp moving across the floor, or soft tapping, like someone was knocking at his door when no one was there. At first, he chalked it up to the house settling, the wind making the walls creak. But the noises grew louder, more insistent, like they were trying to get his attention. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. We were sitting in his living room, just chatting about life. He'd been staring at a spot on the floor for a while, like he was waiting for something to happen. I asked him what was wrong, and he just looked at me. But it wasn't the usual James I knew. His eyes were wide, like he was in some sort of trance, and when he spoke, it was like his voice was coming from somewhere far away. "I don't think I can stay here anymore," he said, but there was no urgency in his voice, no fear, just an odd calmness. "Something's wrong with this place," I laughed, trying to brush it off. "It's just your imagination, man. You're fine." But the next few days were even worse. He didn't talk about the noises anymore, but I could see it in his eyes. He was becoming more withdrawn, more distant. And then, one night, something happened that I'll never be able to forget. I came over after work, like I always did, to grab a beer and hang out. But when I got there, the house felt different. The air was thicker, colder, even though the temperature outside had been mild. The front door was slightly open, and as I stepped inside, it creaked loudly, like it had been left open for a long time. "James," I called out, but there was no answer. I walked through the house, checking room by room, until I found him. He was in the kitchen, standing still, staring at something on the counter. When I approached, I noticed his hands were shaking violently, and his skin looked pale, unnaturally pale, like he hadn't slept in days. "Hey man, you okay?" I asked, trying to get his attention. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes were wide open, but they didn't look like they belonged to him. It was like something was inside him, controlling him. Then, without turning his head, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come," he said. It wasn't his voice. Not entirely. It was deeper, raspier, like it was echoing from far beneath his own. My heart dropped into my stomach. I tried to make a joke, to lighten the mood, but I could feel my hands start to sweat. Something wasn't right. That wasn't James. Not anymore. "James, what are you—" I started, but before I could finish, he turned to me. His head jerked unnaturally, like it wasn't him controlling his movements. His lips curled into a grotesque grin, one that made my stomach churn. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his voice now almost a growl. "This house, it knows you. It wants you, too." I backed away, feeling a cold sweat break out across my body. The air felt oppressive, thick with something I couldn't explain. And then, just as quickly as it happened, he seemed to snap back to himself. He blinked a few times, and the strange, eerie look in his eyes faded. "Sorry, man," he said, his voice returning to normal. "I don't know what came over me, but I knew something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. That wasn't just a weird episode. There was something in that house, something that had taken hold of him, something that wanted him. I didn't want to leave him alone that night. I tried to convince him to stay at my place, but he wouldn't go. "It's nothing," he kept saying. "I'm just tired. I'll be fine." I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would ever see my best friend. Not the way I knew him anyway. The next day, he didn't show up for work. I tried calling, texting, nothing. I drove to his house, but when I knocked, there was no answer. Something told me to leave, but I couldn't just do that. So I went in. The house was silent. Too silent. And that same oppressive air, thick and cold, wrapped around me as I stepped through the door. It didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a tomb. I found him in the living room, sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. His back was to me, and he didn't move when I called his name. I walked closer, and that's when I saw it. The mark. There, on the back of his neck, was a symbol. Something I hadn't seen before, like it had been burned into his skin. It was like a brand, dark and jagged, as if someone had carved it into him. He was barely breathing, like he wasn't even alive. That's when I understood. James wasn't James anymore. Someone else had taken him, something dark and ancient, something that had been lurking in the corners of that house for who knows how long. And now, it had him. I ran, heart pounding in my chest, but as I reached the door, I heard it, his voice, calling my name. It was his voice, but twisted like something was forcing it out. "You can't leave me now." I slammed the door behind me, but I knew he was still there, waiting for me. And every night since then I can still hear him. His voice in the back of my mind calling to me, asking me to come back. But I won't. Because I know whatever's in that house, whatever took James, it's still waiting. And I know now, it doesn't just want him, it wants me too. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me.